Staff Sergeant Maya Chen had been carrying the Barrett M82A1 for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting. Certainly not General Harrison Mitchell, who had made it abundantly clear during her first week at Forward. Operating Base Sentinel that he considered her assignment to his elite reconnaissance unit a bureaucratic mistake that would soon correct itself. The .50 caliber rifle weighed 30 pounds unloaded, and Maya had grown accustomed to the way other soldiers' eyes would linger on her slight frame, all 5 feet 4 inches of her, as she hefted the massive weapon with the same ease most people carried a briefcase. She had learned to ignore the whispered conversations that followed her through the mess hall, the betting pools on how long she'd last, the patronizing offers to help with her equipment. What she couldn't ignore was the general's deliberate dismissal every time she requested permission to take advanced sniper positions during operations. "Chen, you'll maintain overwatch from the standard position," he would say without looking up from his tactical maps, his weathered fingers tracing convoy routes and enemy positions with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything in his 30-year career. "Leave the long-range work to Staff Sergeant Morrison and his team." Morrison, the golden boy of the unit, whose confirmed kill record was plastered across every military publication that would have him. Morrison, who had never taken a shot beyond 1/800 meters and treated every mission briefing like a personal audition for his next medal. Morrison, who had the general's ear, his respect, and his unwavering belief that some things were simply beyond the capabilities of a 23-year-old woman from Portland, Oregon, regardless of what her training records might suggest. Maya had graduated top of her class from the Army Sniper School at Fort Moore, breaking 3 range records in the process. Her instructors had written glowing evaluations, noting her exceptional patience, mathematical precision, and an almost supernatural ability to read wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. She could calculate bullet drop and windage adjustments faster than most people could work a simple arithmetic problem, and her steady hands had never trembled. Not during the stress tests, not during live fire exercises, not even during her first combat deployment when insurgent mortars had been raining down around her hide position for 6 straight hours. But none of that seemed to matter to General Mitchell. To him, she was an experiment gone wrong, a politically correct checkbox that the Pentagon had forced upon his unit. He had made his feelings known during her first performance review, delivered in the sterile confines of his field office while the desert wind rattled the prefab walls. "Chen, I'm not going to pretend this isn't awkward for both of us," he had said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual authority that came from commanding respect through fear rather than admiration. "You're here because some desk jockey in Washington thinks we need diversity in our sniper teams. I'm here because I've kept more soldiers alive than any other commander in this sector. Your presence creates complications." Maya had sat perfectly, still her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral despite the fire building in her chest. She had heard variations of this speech before, from instructors who thought women belonged in support roles, from fellow soldiers who questioned whether she had the physical strength for extended operations, from family members who wondered why she couldn't have chosen a safer career path. But hearing it from the man whose approval could make or break her military future felt like a different kind of wound entirely. "With respect, sir, my qualifications speak for themselves," she had replied, keeping her voice level and professional. "I've completed every training requirement, exceeded every standard, and I'm prepared to prove my capabilities in any scenario you deem appropriate." The general had smiled then, but it wasn't a warm expression. It was the kind of smile a predator might wear while circling wounded prey. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of, Sergeant. You think this is about proving something. Combat isn't a test you can study for or a record you can break. It's about keeping your teammates alive, and I won't risk their lives to satisfy your need for validation." The conversation had ended there, but its effects had lingered through every subsequent mission. Maya found herself relegated to standard Overwatch positions. usually no more than 600 meters from the primary objective, well within the range of any competent marksman. She watched from these positions as Morrison and his team took the challenging shots, the ones that required real skill and precision. She documented their misses, and there were more than the general cared to acknowledge, while maintaining perfect situational awareness and protecting the ground teams exactly as she had been trained to do. The Barrett had become both her burden and her companion during these long months of professional isolation. She knew every component of the rifle by touch, could disassemble and reassemble it in complete darkness in under 4 minutes. She had fired thousands of rounds through its barrel during training exercises and zeroing sessions, pushing the weapon to its limits and discovering her own capabilities in the process. The rifle's theoretical effective range was listed at 1,800 meters, but Maya had consistently achieved tight groupings at distances far beyond that during practice sessions on the range. Not that anyone seemed interested in those achievements. The general's dismissal had created a culture of skepticism that permeated the entire unit. Other soldiers began to question her abilities not because of any observed failures, but because their commanding officer had made it clear that he considered her presence a liability. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. If the general didn't trust her with important assignments, why should anyone else? Maya had tried to bridge this gap through sheer competence and professionalism. She volunteered for every training, exercise, maintained her equipment to spotless standards, and never complained about the mundane assignments she was given. She studied terrain maps until she could draw them from memory, practiced her mathematics until she could calculate complex ballistic solutions in her head, and spent countless hours in the gym ensuring that her physical conditioning never became a point of criticism. But excellence, she was learning, could be its own form of isolation when it existed within a system that refused to acknowledge it. The breaking point had come 3 weeks ago during a routine reconnaissance mission in the Helmand province. The unit had been tasked with gathering intelligence on a suspected Taliban weapons cache hidden in a compound approximately 200 meters from their observation post. Morrison had attempted the identification shot, a precision strike on a specific building corner that would allow the ground team to assess structural weaknesses, and had missed by nearly 8 feet, his bullet striking a retaining wall and alerting the entire compound to their presence. Maya had watched through her spotting scope as chaos erupted below. Insurgents had poured from buildings, taking defensive positions and preparing for an assault that could have been avoided entirely if the initial shot had been successful. The mission had been aborted, intelligence had been lost, and 3 soldiers had been wounded during the hasty extraction that followed. That night, as she cleaned her rifle in the dim light of her quarters, Maya had made a decision that would either vindicate her years of training or end her military career entirely. She was going to find a way to prove that her capabilities extended far beyond what the general was willing to acknowledge, and she was going to do it in a manner so undeniable that even his prejudices would be forced to yield to reality. 3. Barrett seemed heavier that night as she worked, but Maya carried that weight with a sense of purpose that had been missing for months. Somewhere out there, beyond the theoretical limits that others had imposed upon her, was a shot that would change everything. The opportunity Maya had been waiting for materialized at 3:47 hours on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide her life into before and after. She had been awakened not by the usual réveillé, but by the urgent buzzing of her encrypted communication device, a sound that meant only one thing: emergency deployment. The briefing room was already crowded when she arrived, still adjusting her gear and trying to shake off the disorientation of sudden awakening. General Mitchell stood at the front, his usually immaculate uniform slightly wrinkled, suggesting he too had been pulled from sleep. Behind him, a large tactical display showed satellite imagery of a mountainous region she didn't immediately recognize, marked with red circles and threat assessments that made her pulse quicken. "Gentlemen," the general began, then caught sight of Maya and added with barely concealed irritation, And Sergeant Chen, we have a developing situation that requires immediate response. The intelligence was devastating in its simplicity. A convoy of humanitarian aid workers, doctors, nurses, and engineers from various international organizations had been captured by a Taliban splinter group led by a commander known only as the Ghost. Unlike typical kidnapping operations designed for ransom or prisoner exchange, this group had made their intentions horrifyingly clear. They planned to execute the hostages on live video as part of a propaganda campaign designed to discourage international aid efforts in the region. But here was where the situation became uniquely challenging and where Maya felt the first stirrings of possibility. The Ghost had chosen his stronghold with tactical brilliance, a fortress-like compound built into the side of a mountain, accessible only through a narrow valley that would turn any rescue attempt into a slaughter. The compound sat at an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, surrounded by terrain so hostile that even their most advanced helicopters couldn't maintain stable flight patterns for more than a few minutes at a time. The hostages are being held in the main building, General Mitchell continued, using a laser pointer to highlight structures on the satellite image. Intelligence suggests they'll be moved to an execution site at approximately 1200 hours, less than 8 hours from now. Traditional rescue operations are impossible due to the terrain and defensive positions. Maya studied the imagery with growing excitement that she fought to keep from showing on her face. The compound was positioned on what appeared to be a natural shelf of rock with commanding views of the surrounding valleys. But that same elevation and isolation that made it defensible also made it visible from extreme distances. Her mind was already calculating angles, atmospheric conditions, and bullet trajectories when Morrison raised his hand. "Sir, what's our angle of approach? If we can get within 1,500 meters, I can provide covering fire for a ground assault team." The general's expression grew grim. "That's the problem, Staff Sergeant. The closest we can position ourselves without being detected is here." He pointed to a ridge system approximately 3,200 meters from the target compound. "At that distance, even our best equipment is pushing theoretical limits." Maya felt her heart skip. 3,200 meters. It was a distance that existed in the realm of legend among snipers, the kind of shot that people talked about in hushed tones but rarely attempted in practice. The mathematics alone were staggering. At that range, she would need to account not just for bullet drop and wind, but for the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, temperature variations at different altitudes, humidity changes, and a dozen other variables that most marksmen never even considered. "The mission parameters are straightforward," General Mitchell continued. "We need someone to neutralize the Ghost himself. Without their leader, intelligence suggests the group will fragment and likely abandon the execution plan. The problem is that no one has been able to achieve consistent accuracy at the required distance." Maya's hand was moving before her conscious mind had made the decision to raise it. Every eye in the room turned to her, and she felt the familiar weight of skepticism and dismissal. But this time, something was different. This time, desperation had entered the equation. "Sir, I'd like to volunteer for the assignment." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the room. Morrison actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "Chen, this isn't a training exercise," he said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone she had grown to despise. "We're talking about a precision shot at a distance where most rifles can't even reach the target, let alone hit it. This requires experience with extreme long-range shooting." "Which I have," Maya replied calmly, though her pulse was hammering against her throat. "My training records show consistent accuracy at distances exceeding 2,800 meters, and I've studied the ballistic requirements for shots beyond 3,000 meters extensively." General Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Studied is not the same as executed, Sergeant. This mission cannot afford experimentation or learning curves. Lives are at stake." but Maya could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Uncertainty. The same certainty that had allowed him to dismiss her capabilities for months was now working against him. He had no other options. Morrison's maximum effective range was 1,800 meters, and even that was optimistic given the environmental conditions they would be facing. The other snipers in the unit had similar limitations. For the first time since she had arrived at FOB, Sentinel, Maya represented not a liability, but a possibility. "Sir," she pressed, "with respect, my qualifications at this distance exceed those of any other marksman in the unit. The Barrett M82A1 is capable of engaging targets at distances up to 3,500 meters under optimal conditions, and I've trained specifically for high-altitude, long-range engagements." The twist that Maya couldn't have anticipated came from an unexpected source. Captain Sarah Williams, the unit's intelligence officer, and one of the few people who had treated Maya with consistent professionalism, stepped forward with a tablet in her hands. "General, if I may," Captain Williams said, her voice carrying an urgency that commanded attention. "I've been reviewing Sergeant Chen's complete training file, including classified evaluations that weren't part of her standard transfer documents." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. There were aspects of her training that she had never discussed. Programs she had participated in that existed in the gray areas between official military doctrine and experimental weapons development. She had assumed those records would remain buried in Pentagon databases, never to see the light of operational day. During her assignment to the Advanced Marksmanship Research Program at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Captain Williams continued, Sergeant Chen participated in experimental long-range shooting trials using modified ammunition and atmospheric calculation systems. According to these records, she successfully engaged targets at distances up to 3,400 meters with a 78% hit probability. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Maya had never spoken about Aberdeen to anyone in the unit, partly because the work had been classified, but mostly because she had learned that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof, and proof was exactly what General Mitchell had never allowed her to provide. Morrison's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. No one shoots consistently at those distances." "The program was discontinued," Captain Williams continued, "not because it was unsuccessful, but because the military deemed the training costs prohibitive for widespread implementation. Only 12 soldiers completed the full program. Sergeant Chen was one of them." General Mitchell was staring at Maya now, with an expression she had never seen before, not dismissal or skepticism, but something approaching recognition. "Why didn't you mention this during your initial assignment briefing?" Maya straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "Because you never asked about my specialized training, sir. You made your assessment of my capabilities based on standard metrics, and I respected your command authority." The truth was more complex, of course. She had tried to mention her additional qualifications during that first disastrous performance review, but the general had cut her off before she could explain the full scope of her training. Over time, she had learned that mentioning Aberdeen only seemed to make people more skeptical, not less. Extraordinary claims, after all, required extraordinary proof. "The environmental conditions for this shot will be challenging," Maya continued, seizing the moment of uncertainty to press her case. "The altitude will reduce air density, affecting bullet trajectory. Wind patterns in mountainous terrain are notoriously unpredictable. Temperature variations between our position and the target zone will create atmospheric distortion. But these are exactly the conditions we trained for at Aberdeen." She could see the general's internal struggle playing out across his features. His prejudices, his certainties about her limitations were crashing against the cold reality of operational necessity. 8 international aid workers were going to die in less than 8 hours unless someone could make an impossible shot, and Maya was the only person in the room with training that even approached the requirements. Captain Williams sealed the argument with a revelation that stunned everyone, including Maya herself. "There's something else, General. The intelligence on the ghost's location came from a source inside the compound. One of the aid workers managed to get a message out before communications were severed. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team leader. She's also Sergeant Chen's sister. Maya felt the world tilt on its axis. Elena, her older sister, the brilliant surgeon who had joined Doctors Without Borders against their parents' wishes, who had spent the last 3 years bringing medical care to some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Maya hadn't even known Elena was in Afghanistan. Their communications had been sporadic due to security concerns, and their last conversation had been a brief video call 6 weeks ago. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Personal stakes had entered the equation, transforming an already complex mission into something that transcended military protocol. Maya felt every eye in the room watching her, waiting to see if this revelation would strengthen her resolve or compromise her judgment. "That changes things," General Mitchell said slowly. "Personal involvement in combat operations can lead to poor decision-making, compromised judgment. It can also provide the motivation necessary for extraordinary performance," Maya interrupted, her voice steady despite the emotional maelstrom building inside her chest. "Sir, I've trained for this exact scenario. I have the equipment, the skills, and now I have stakes that match the importance of the mission. Give me this opportunity." Morrison made one final attempt to maintain his position as the unit's primary sniper. "General, even if Chen has some specialized training, this shot is beyond what any single person should attempt. Let me take the standard position at 1,500 meters. I can provide harassment fire, maybe create enough confusion to facilitate a ground assault. At 1,500 meters, you'll be within range of their defensive positions," Maya countered. "They'll know exactly where you are after your first shot, and you'll become the target instead of providing support. At 3,200 meters, I'll be beyond their ability to effectively return fire, and if I miss, I can adjust and try again." The general looked between them, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he processed the options. Maya could see the moment when his military pragmatism finally overcame his personal biases. The mission parameters were clear: neutralize the ghost, save the hostages, minimize casualties among their own forces. Maya represented the best, and possibly the only chance, of achieving those objectives. "Very well, Sergeant Chen," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could end careers or save lives. "You'll take the shot. But understand this. If you fail, if your sister's situation compromises your performance, the consequences will extend far beyond this mission. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Maya stood at attention, feeling the Barrett's familiar weight across her shoulders and the crushing pressure of 8 lives hanging in the balance. "Yes, sir, I am." As the briefing dissolved into tactical planning and equipment preparation, Maya caught Captain Williams by the arm. "How long have you known about Elena?" "The intelligence came in 20 minutes ago," Williams replied. "I cross-referenced the hostage list against personnel files as standard procedure. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Maya nodded, her mind already shifting into the focused state she would need for the hours ahead. Personal emotions would have to wait. Right now, she had a shot to prepare for. A shot that would either validate 3 years of doubt and dismissal or confirm every skepticism that had been directed at her capabilities. The Barrett had never felt heavier, but Maya had never been more ready to carry that weight. The helicopter ride to the insertion point was a study in controlled chaos. Maya sat strapped against the vibrating metal wall of the Black Hawk, her Barrett secured in a custom case beside her, while the rest of the hastily assembled team ran through final equipment checks. The aircraft bucked and rolled through mountain thermals that seemed determined to remind everyone aboard that they were operating at the very limits of mechanical possibility. Across from her, Corporal Jake Martinez, her assigned spotter for the mission, was reviewing meteorological data on a ruggedized tablet, his face illuminated by the green glow of the display. Martinez was young, barely 22, but he had a reputation for mathematical precision that rivaled computer systems. More importantly, he was one of the few soldiers in the unit who had never treated Maya's presence as anything other than professional necessity. "Winds are going to be problematic," he shouted over the rotor noise, leaning close so she could hear him. "We're looking at variable crosswinds between 8 and 15 knots at our position, but the atmospheric modeling suggests they could be completely different at the target elevation. Temperature differential is going to create thermal layers that could deflect the bullet path by several feet if we don't account for them correctly." Maya nodded, her mind already processing the implications. At 3,200 meters, environmental factors didn't just influence the shot, they dominated it. The .50 caliber round would spend nearly 4 seconds in flight, during which time it would be subject to every atmospheric variable between the rifle's muzzle and the Ghost's position. Wind wasn't just about lateral deflection. Vertical wind shear could cause the bullet to rise or fall unexpectedly. Temperature gradients could create mirage effects that made precise target acquisition nearly impossible. Humidity variations would affect air density, which in turn would influence bullet velocity and trajectory. "What's our timeline looking like?" Maya asked, checking her watch. It was 0630 hours, 5.5 hours until the projected execution time. Captain Williams, who had insisted on accompanying the team to coordinate intelligence updates, looked up from her communications equipment. "Latest intel suggests they're moving the hostages to the execution site earlier than expected. New timeline puts us at approximately 1,000 hours, 3.5 hours from now." The margin for error had just been compressed by nearly half. Maya felt her pulse quicken, but forced herself to maintain the steady breathing pattern she had learned during stress inoculation training. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not with Elena's life hanging in the balance. The insertion went smoothly, which in Maya's experience usually meant that complications were being saved for later when they would be more inconvenient. The team rappelled from the helicopter onto a rocky outcropping that provided natural concealment while offering sight lines to their target area. As the Black Hawk disappeared into the morning haze, Maya was struck by the profound silence that replaced the mechanical noise, a silence broken only by wind patterns that would soon become either her greatest ally or her most dangerous enemy. The movement to their firing position took 45 minutes of careful navigation through terrain that seemed designed to punish human ambition. The rocks were loose and unstable, threatening to send cascades of stone tumbling down the mountainside with each misplaced step. The altitude made every breath feel insufficient, and Maya found herself grateful for the conditioning training that had prepared her for operations in thin air. But when they finally reached the position Martinez had selected based on satellite imagery and ballistic calculations, Maya felt her first moment of genuine doubt since accepting the mission. The target compound was visible through her spotting scope, but it appeared impossibly distant, a collection of tan-colored buildings that looked more like architectural models than actual structures containing human beings. "Range confirmed at 3,247 meters. Martinez reported, his voice steadied despite the magnitude of the distance involved. "Target elevation is 127 feet above our position. Wind at our location is currently northeast at 12 knots, gusting to 16. Maya settled behind the Barrett, adjusting the bipod legs until the rifle felt like a natural extension of her body. The weapon had been modified specifically for extreme long-range engagements, a custom barrel, precision-manufactured ammunition, and an advanced scope system that could compensate for atmospheric distortion. But even with these enhancements, she was attempting something that existed at the very edge of possibility. Through the scope, the compound gradually resolved into individual structures. Maya could see figures moving between buildings, but at this distance, identifying specific individuals was nearly impossible. The ghost could be any one of the dozen people visible in the compound, and she would have only one opportunity to make the correct identification and take the shot. That was when the mission took another unexpected turn. "Maya," "This is Overwatch," Captain Williams's voice crackled through her earpiece. "We're receiving a transmission from inside the compound. Someone's managed to activate an emergency beacon." Maya's heart lurched. "Elena?" "We don't know yet, but the signal is coming from the main building where the hostages are being held. The transmission is weak and intermittent, but we're picking up what sounds like deliberate tapping. Morse code." Martinez looked up from his spotting scope. "Can you decode it?" There was a pause. Then Williams's voice returned with barely concealed excitement. "It's coordinates. Specific grid references for target identification. Someone inside is trying to help us locate the ghost." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Elena had been an Army communications specialist before medical school. She would know Morse code, and she would understand exactly what kind of assistance a long-range sniper would need. But sending that information also meant exposing herself to incredible danger. If the ghost discovered she was communicating with rescue forces. "The coordinates placed the target in the northeast corner of the main building," Williams continued. "Second floor, corner room with windows facing your direction. But Maya, you need to know. The transmission stopped abruptly 30 seconds. Ego. We don't know if the beacon was discovered or if—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Maya understood the implications perfectly. Elena had risked everything to provide targeting information, and now she might be paying the price for that courage. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated. "New intelligence," Williams announced. "Drone surveillance shows increased activity in the compound. They're moving people around. Looks like they're accelerating their timeline again. You may have less than an hour." Maya forced herself to focus on the technical challenge ahead of her. Emotional reaction would have to wait until after the shot. Through her scope, she could see the corner room Elena had identified, and occasionally, a figure appeared in one of the windows. But positive identification at this distance remained nearly impossible. That was when Martinez made a discovery that changed everything. "Maya, look at this," he said, handing her a high-powered spotting scope with advanced image stabilization. "Third window from the left, second floor. There's something reflective in that room. Looks like someone's using a mirror or piece of metal to create signal flashes." Maya peered through the scope and saw it immediately. Deliberate flashes of reflected sunlight coming from the target window. 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes again. SOS in International Morse code, but being transmitted visually instead of audibly. "Elena," she whispered. But as she watched, another figure appeared in the window, larger, moving with the aggressive posture of someone in command. The figure grabbed something from whoever had been creating the signal flashes, and Maya saw what looked like a struggle taking place in the distant room. "Target acquired," she announced, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil building in her chest. "Second floor, corner room, northeast window. Male figure, approximately 6 feet tall, dark clothing." Martinez began calling out environmental readings. Wind has shifted to northwest at 14 knots, gusting to 18. Temperature at target location estimated at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 42%. Barometric pressure is falling. We may have weather moving. Maya began the familiar ritual of long-range shooting preparation, but nothing about this felt familiar. The distance was unprecedented, the stakes were personal, and she was operating with equipment and knowledge that pushed every boundary she had ever encountered. The Barrett felt enormous beneath her, its 30-pound weight distributed across the rocky ground through the bipod system. The mathematics alone were staggering. At 3,247 meters, the bullet would drop approximately 347 inches during its flight. Time of 3.8 seconds. But that calculation assumed standard atmospheric conditions, and nothing about this situation was standard. The altitude, temperature variations, and wind patterns would all influence the trajectory in ways that required constant recalculation. Maya adjusted her scope to account for the initial ballistic solution, then began the delicate process of reading the environmental conditions between her position and the target. Wind was the most challenging variable. She could measure it at her location, but the bullet would encounter different wind conditions at various points during its flight. She watched for visual indicators: the movement of dust near the compound, the way fabric moved on clothing lines, the behavior of smoke from what appeared to be a small fire in the courtyard. "Target is mobile," Martinez reported. "He's moving around the room but returning to the window periodically. Looks like he's—" "Jesus, Maya, I think he's setting something up. Camera equipment, maybe." The execution was starting. Maya felt time compress around her as adrenaline sharpened her focus to laser-like intensity. Every environmental reading, every mathematical calculation, every breath became part of a complex system designed to place a single bullet in a specific location at a specific moment in time. Through her scope, she could see the ghost more clearly now. He was positioned near the window, and behind him, Maya could make out other figures, the hostages, including what she desperately hoped was Elena. The range was so extreme that individual faces remained indistinct, but she could see enough to know that whatever was about to happen in that room would determine the fate of 8 innocent people. "Wind's dying down," Martinez reported. 14 knots, steady from the northwest. "This might be your best window." Maya settled into the final shooting position, her body becoming one with the rifle, her breathing slowing to the rhythm she had practiced thousands of times. But as she placed her finger on the trigger, preparing to take the most important shot of her life, she noticed something that made her blood turn to ice. There were 2 figures in the target window now, and one of them was being held directly in front of the ghost, a human shield positioned exactly where Maya's bullet would need to pass to reach her target. The hostage was small, female, with dark hair that caught the morning sunlight. Even at this impossible distance, Maya somehow knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at Elena. The shot that was supposed to save her sister had become the shot that might kill her. Maya's world condensed to the circle of her scope, where 2 human figures stood framed against a window 3,247 meters away. The ghost held Elena directly in front of him, using her body as a shield while he positioned what appeared to be video equipment on a tripod. Through the advanced optics, Maya could see Elena's face, pale, defiant, unmistakably her sister despite the distance and distortion. "Target is using a hostage as cover," Maya reported, her voice mechanical despite the emotional storm raging inside her chest. "Female, approximately 5'6", dark hair, positioned directly between shooter and primary target." Martinez lowered his spotting scope. "Maya, I know who it is." The words came out harder than she intended. "Continue environmental readings." But even as she maintained professional composure, Maya's mind was racing through possibilities that existed at the intersection of ballistics and nightmares. The ghost was holding Elena close enough that any shot designed to neutralize him would pass within inches of her body. At this distance, even a millimeter of miscalculation could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. Captain Williams's voice crackled through the earpiece. "Overwatch to Sniper 1. We're receiving another transmission from inside. Very weak signal, but it's definitely Morse code. Can you decode it?" There was a pause, then Williams's voice returned with an undertone Maya had never heard before, a mixture of admiration and fear. "It says, 'Trust your training. I trust you. Take the shot.'" Maya felt her hands tremble for the first time in her military career. Elena wasn't just sending targeting information, she was giving permission for Maya to attempt a shot that could end her life. It was an act of faith so profound that it transcended family bonds and entered the realm of pure trust between one soldier and another. "Maya," Martinez said quietly, "the math doesn't work. Not with a human shield positioned that close to the target. The margin of error at this distance is too great." He was right, and Maya knew it. Every calculation she had performed, every Environmental variables she had accounted for assumed a clear shot at a stationary target. Adding Elena's presence changed everything. The ghost was using her not just as psychological leverage, but as a practical barrier that made precision shooting virtually impossible. That was when Maya remembered something from her training at Aberdeen, a technique so dangerous and experimental that it had been attempted only a handful of times and never in actual combat conditions. It was called displacement shooting, and it involved using the target's own body position to create a ricochet angle that could reach around obstacles. The theory was simple. The execution was nearly impossible. Instead of shooting directly at the ghost, Maya would aim for a specific point on the window frame or wall surface, calculating the angle and velocity needed to cause the bullet to fragment, or deflect in a predictable direction. If the calculations were perfect, if the environmental conditions remained stable, if the target didn't move at the critical moment, the deflected bullet could neutralize the ghost while leaving Elena unharmed. If any of those variables were wrong, the result would be catastrophic. "Martinez," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to calculate ricochet angles for the window frame, southeast corner, approximately 18 inches to the right of the target's current position." Martinez stared at her. "You're talking about displacement shooting." "Maya, that's theoretical. No one's ever successfully executed that technique in field conditions." "I have." The admission hung in the air between them. During her final week at Aberdeen, Maya had been part of an experimental training exercise that tested displacement shooting under controlled conditions. She had successfully executed 3 displacement shots out of 5 attempts, hitting targets positioned behind barriers by calculating precise ricochet angles. But those had been training rounds, stationary targets, and measured distances in perfect weather conditions. "Even if you could pull it off," Martinez continued, "the variables at this distance are enormous. A 1-degree miscalculation in angle could send the bullet anywhere within a 6-foot radius, and that's assuming the window frame material behaves predictably under impact." Through her scope, Maya could see the ghost making final adjustments to his camera equipment. Other figures moved in the background, the remaining hostages being positioned for what would undoubtedly be their final moments. Time was running out, and conventional shooting solutions had been eliminated by Elena's position as a human shield. But as Maya studied the target area more closely, she noticed something that changed the entire tactical equation. The window frame where the ghost stood wasn't made of wood or standard construction materials. It was reinforced steel, probably installed as part of the compound's defensive modifications. Steel created more predictable ricochet patterns than other materials, especially when struck at specific angles by high-velocity rounds. More importantly, Maya could see that the ghost wasn't holding Elena randomly. He was positioning her in a way that kept his own center mass partially exposed, a sliver of torso visible to the right of Elena's shoulder. It was perhaps 6 inches of target area, but it was a direct line of sight that wouldn't require ricochet calculations or experimental techniques. The shot was possible, but it would require precision that existed beyond anything Maya had ever attempted. At 3,247 meters, 6 inches of target area represented an angular measurement so small that atmospheric distortion could easily obscure it entirely. The mathematical requirements were staggering. She would need to account not just for bullet drop and wind drift, but for the precise movement patterns of both the ghost and Elena, the optical distortion created by air density variations, and the mechanical limitations of her equipment. "New plan," Maya announced. "Direct shot, target's right torso, visible area between hostage's left shoulder and window frame. Estimated target area 6 inches vertical, 4 inches horizontal." Martinez ran the calculations quickly. "That's a 0.15 milliradian target at current range. Maya, that's smaller than the mechanical accuracy limits of most rifle systems. Even with the Barrett's precision capabilities, you're talking about a shot that requires perfect conditions and flawless execution. What are current environmental conditions? Wind northwest at 13 knots, steady. Temperature stable at 64 degrees. Barometric pressure has stabilized. Humidity dropping to 38%. Martinez paused. Actually, conditions are as good as they're going to get. If you're going to attempt this, now is the time. Maya settled into her final shooting position, feeling the familiar weight of the Barrett distribute across her body and the rocky ground. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm she had practiced 10,000 times, each exhale releasing tension and sharpening focus. The scope's reticle centered on the narrow slice of target area visible beside Elena's shoulder. Through the optics, she could see the ghost's face more clearly now. Angular features, focused expression, completely unaware that death was calculating its approach from over 3 kilometers away. Behind him, the other hostages were arranged in a line, and Maya realized this wasn't just an execution, it was a propaganda event designed to be broadcast around the world. Overwatch to Sniper 1. Williams's voice interrupted her concentration. We're detecting increased radio traffic from the compound. Multiple frequencies, coordinated communications. They may be preparing to begin the execution sequence. Maya made final adjustments to her scope, compensating for the precise environmental conditions Martinez had calculated. The mathematical solution was elegant in its complexity. 347 inches of bullet drop, 23 inches of wind drift, corrections for altitude and temperature, adjustments for the Earth's rotation during the bullet's 3.8-second flight time. Every variable had been measured, calculated, and incorporated into a firing solution that existed at the absolute limit of human and mechanical capability. But as she placed her finger on the trigger, preparing to take the shot that would define her career and possibly save 8 lives, Maya heard something that stopped her cold. Elena's voice, transmitted through the emergency beacon, speaking in the clear, professional tone Maya remembered from their childhood. Maya, if you can hear this, you need to know. There's a bomb in this room. Timer shows 4 minutes. Even if you neutralize the target, we need immediate extraction. The entire building is wired to explode. The mission had just become infinitely more complex. Even a perfect shot wouldn't save the hostages if they couldn't be extracted before the explosives detonated. Maya was no longer just attempting to neutralize a target at impossible range. She was racing against a countdown that could render her success meaningless. Through her earpiece, she heard the rapid coordination of extraction teams, helicopter pilots calculating flight times, and tactical planners trying to compress a 30-minute rescue operation into a 4-minute window. But all of that coordination depended on her making a shot that existed at the very edge of possibility. Maya's breathing steadied into the final rhythm. Her finger took up slack on the trigger. The target area held steady in her scope, 6 inches of exposed torso framed by her sister's shoulder and a steel window frame. 3,247 meters of mountain air separated the Barrett's muzzle from the ghost's chest. She had trained for this moment through years of preparation, months of dismissal, and hours of mathematical calculation. Every variable had been measured, every environmental factor accounted for. The shot was as perfect as human capability could make it. Maya exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared, its massive report echoing across the mountainside like thunder. The rifle's recoil drove back against her shoulder with familiar force, but Maya's eyes never left. The scope. Through the optics, she watched a .50 caliber bullet begin its 3.8-second journey across impossible distance, carrying with it the hopes of 8 hostages, the vindication of years of doubt, and the weight of a sister's trust. Time slowed too. The rhythm of physics and faith, as Maya Chen finally got her chance to prove that some shots are worth taking, no matter how impossible they might seem.